All right. All right. So where does photosynthesis take place? Just generally. Somebody tell me.
In leaves.
In leaves, okay? A little bit less generally.
The mesophyll layer of leaves.
Okay, in the mesophyll layer, even less general.
Chlorophyll.
Well, a chlorophyll is, in chloroplasts, which are the organelle, and then specifically in pigments like chlorophyll. So now, you have some photosynthetic organisms like cyanobacteria that don't have chloroplasts. In fact, they're believed to be the ancestor to chloroplasts in eukaryotic cells. Unless, of course, the eukaryotic cells came first and the cyanobacteria are renegade chloroplasts. Right? Think about that one. We'll deal with that question maybe the week after spring break. Should we think of that the most primitive life forms are prokaryotic cells or the most primitive life forms are eukaryotic cells? If you were actually going to root all life back to a single ancestor. But in cyanobacteria photosynthesis, they don't have chloroplasts, and so the photosynthesis takes place in the plasma membrane and in the cytosol. Some of it takes place in the solution. So in eukaryotes, we don't have chloroplasts. Eukaryotic photosynthetic organisms have chloroplasts with three membraned structures. And so the light-dependent reactions happen in the innermost membrane called the thylakoid membranes. And they're basically stacked up in these complex stacks that we call grana. Okay, as plural, granum is singular. And so that's the innermost membrane. The light-independent reactions take place in the fluid of the chloroplasts. So then you may be thinking, well, what are the other two membranes for? Right? In the mitochondria, we saw that there are two membranes. The inner membrane's got a lot of the machinery, and then there's some nice space in between the membranes to build up a concentration gradient. So you still have that advantage in the two outer membranes of the chloroplasts, but a lot of that is actually built up in some slightly different ways. All right. So here is an image of a chloroplast. Here are the outer membranes. So the outer and then the inner outer membrane and then the thylakoid membranes that are, again, stacked up in these stacks that we call grana. And so there is fluid inside of the thylakoid membrane and there's fluid outside. The fluid outside is called the stroma. Okay, the fluid inside is called the lumen of the thylakoid. Okay, so we still have a place in which we can build up concentrations, really large hydrogen ion concentrations. Yeah.
Are those membranes phospholipid bilayers?
Yes. Yep.
So we have three
Bilayers. Yep.
Okay.
So 6 total layers of phospholipids and cholesterols. It's not just phospholipids in there.
So if the mitochondria is theorized to come from phagocytosis,
sure.
Could they say the same thing with the chloroplasts?
Yes. Yep. And the idea here is the reason why there are 3 membranes, because this would be 1, this would be 2, and this would be 3, is that this is not primary endosymbiosis, but rather secondary endosymbiosis. So this inner membrane came from the first time a cyanobacterium was phagocytized by a eukaryotic cell, and then another line of eukaryotic cells that gave rise to most of your eukaryotic photosynthetic organisms actually phagocytized another eukaryotic cell that had already phagocytized a cyanobacterium. So this would be the membrane from the cyanobacterium. This is the membrane from the original eukaryote in the primary endosymbiotic event. This is the membrane from the secondary endosymbiotic event. Yeah. And then chloroplasts reproduce separately from the cell like mitochondria do. Chloroplasts have their own DNA like mitochondria do. And so you've got some nice parts of that story. But again, we're going to deal with this the week after spring break. So if you want to deal with this, we will, just not right now. All right. Now, the last question we're going to ask in this first set before we get into our light-dependent reactions is just how does the entire plant function in photosynthesis? You said leaves, right, Joey? That plants and they really photosynthesize in anything green. So most of it happens in the leaves because that's where most of the surface area is. But anything green in a plant is green because it has chlorophyll. And if it has chlorophyll, you better believe it's taking part in photosynthesis. But other parts of the plant are responsible for other parts. So remember, carbon dioxide is a reactant of photosynthesis, right? What does that mean? If it is a reactant of photosynthesis, what does that mean? Photosynthesis requires it. If you don't have carbon dioxide, you do not do photosynthesis. And so there are structures in the plants, in the stems and in the leaves, called stomata, which are openings to allow carbon dioxide to diffuse into the plant's tissues. A lot of it in the surrounding air, less of it inside the plant's tissues, because what's inside of the plant's tissues is being converted into sugars. Okay, and so carbon dioxide is going to diffuse in. But there are some plants, you got to keep that in mind, because there are some plants that have to keep stomata closed to protect themselves from water loss. And so if their stomata are closed, carbon dioxide's not getting in. Carbon dioxide's not getting in, you're not carrying out photosynthesis. Oxygen and water made during photosynthesis exit through the stomata. You call that transpiration when water exits through the stomata and then evaporates up into the air. It's called transpiration, not perspiration. So plants don't perspire like we perspire, but they do transpire. And a significant amount of the water activity as water is moving around the globe is actually coming from transpiration and not from evaporation. Although there's a lot coming from evaporation as well. And then even the non-photosynthetic parts play a huge role. The roots and then vessels in vascular plants function to draw water and minerals out of the soil. And so water is very obvious. Water is another reactant of photosynthesis, right? With no water, no photosynthesis. Minerals are not necessarily a reactant of photosynthesis, but it's a reminder that plants are living cells. Yes? And what are some elements that living cells need that don't come from water or carbon dioxide? Nitrogen. Nitrogen's a big one, right? There's no nitrogen in carbon dioxide or in water, but nitrogen is one of the big four of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. There's nitrogen in basically all of our complex organic molecules. Okay? Minus, you usually don't find a ton in a lot of your carbohydrates, unless, of course, you're talking about chitin and some other things. But anyways, in your proteins, in your nucleic acids, if you're going to build DNA and you're going to make proteins, you need a lot of nitrogen. Plants build DNA and they make proteins. They need a lot of nitrogen. So that's a big one that they need to absorb out of the soil. What else? Phosphorus. The two big ones in most fertilizers are nitrogen and phosphorus. And so usually if you grab a bag of fertilizer, how many of you like garden for fun? Or garden for necessity? It's like, it's not for fun, it's so I can live, right? If you look on the back of a bag of fertilizer, it usually talks about nitrogen and phosphorus because those are the two big ones. What do we need phosphorus for? Where's phosphorus in organic molecules? ATP, and ATP is a type of what? It's a nucleotide, which means it's a type of nucleic acid. DNA, RNA, and then ATP is an RNA nucleotide involve a phosphate group, and a phosphate group has phosphorus. And if you're going to make phosphate groups, you need phosphorus, right? Is that okay? All right, cool. And then the same vessels that bring water to the photosynthetic parts will carry sugars around the plant to feed all of the cells in the various parts of the plant. So all of the plant is important for this process of photosynthesis, not just the photosynthetic parts. But here's an image of a leaf, and here's a stomata. And so actually this would be a stoma, is singular, stomata is plural. This would be a stoma in which carbon dioxide can diffuse in, oxygen can diffuse out, water can transpire out, and then here you have a whole series of photosynthetic cells, and they are just packed full of chloroplasts. Chloroplast lining most of the cell, and because the limiting factor, there are 3 factors limiting the rate of photosynthesis. Can you predict what those 3 factors are? Oh, I guess so. Let's go 4. I didn't even think of sunlight. How did you forget sunlight? Gosh, that was terrible of me. I'm telling you, I'm failing a lot this week. I'm sorry. So sunlight, carbon dioxide, water, and chlorophyll, pigments. Okay, those are your 4 limiting factors. So you need to, as a plant, you need access to sunlight, you need to access to water, you need access to carbon dioxide, and you need to have enough chlorophyll so that you don't become saturated and you can just keep going and going and going and going and going. Otherwise, you can't go anymore because all of your chlorophylls are involved or taken up. Gosh, how did I forget sunlight? That's terrible. That's embarrassing. All right. So our next set of questions are going to deal with the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis. But before we get into these questions, I want to take ourselves a lecture break. Okay? And so we've talked already about ways in which photosynthesis and cellular respiration are sort of opposite. Okay? And so what I want you to do is taking that information that in photosynthesis carbon is reduced, in cellular respiration carbon is oxidized, right? We know this. I want you to take that amount of information and I want you to try to predict what are your overall products of your light-dependent reactions. So the parts of photosynthesis where you are harnessing sunlight and harnessing it for something, okay? So don't look at your notes or any further if you already know it, because you've got this down. That's fine. You can share it with those around you. But not looking at anything else, I want you to try to make some predictions of what the plant is going to make as it is harnessing the energy from sunlight and preparing it to do the rest. All right? So go ahead.
Just the light dependent?
Just the light dependent. Although I imagine some of you are going to slip in products of the light independent, but that's okay. All right, take a couple of minutes starting now. You don't have any extra slips?
They definitely need to make the hydrogen ions that are going to be. That gradient. I'm confused.
Go for it.
I'm pretty sure that's most of the carriers, like LDPH. What's the other one? FADH.
Are the same? I don't think the same. Well, yeah. So NADPH is in plants.
So we just say reduced electron carriers? Because basically we're saying with glucose, so carbon is reduced. Carbon is reduced during the light. So we need to prepare. So we need to prepare the stuff we need to So we need reduced pure electrons.
And we need, there's like not that much.
Well, no, the ATPs that you made. Well,
No, you
yes,
just
yeah.
yeah,
So they build up the hydrogen thing bonds and then they go through the ATP phase. Okay, so yes. I'm running through the step now.
Alrighty. So we have any groups wanting to give us some of the products of the light-dependent reactions? Let me start here. So I mentioned a complication. The only way to get carbon dioxide into a plant, it's not the only way, the main way to get carbon dioxide into a plant is by opening the stomata and allowing carbon dioxide to diffuse into the plant's tissues. If in order to protect yourself from water loss, you got to keep those closed during the driest, hottest part of the day, you shouldn't predict your sugars, which is where you're actually taking the carbon dioxide and making something, happening during the light-dependent portions, right? That should happen in the absence of light, because some plants actually, by necessity, have to separate those two processes. Most plants, the two processes are happening simultaneously, but many plants that live in really dry, really hot places, like ours, right, that they actually have to separate those. Either separate them into different cells or separate them into different times and only go through at night. Okay, so sugars are not a product of the light-dependent reaction. Yeah. What do you got, Alyssa?
Oh, okay. We're just thinking that we need electron transport carriers.
Okay.
Electrons, so like NADPH and FADPH.
Sure. And so,
a little bit of ATP.
okay, so as it's actually a lot of ATP. What we mentioned, when energy transfers, it's the movement of electrons. Where do those electrons come from in photosynthesis? From water, right? So those electrons are coming from water. That's something you need to keep in mind. The electrons are coming from water, but something needs to be reduced. Overall in photosynthesis, what gets reduced? Carbon, right? It gets oxidized in cellular respiration, reduced in photosynthesis. But I just told you that by necessity, you have to reduce carbon separate from your light-dependent processes, because some plants actually have to partition them into separate parts of the day. And so it's not carbon getting reduced, but something needs to get reduced. And NADP gets reduced into NADPH, or NAD+. NADP plus gets reduced into NADPH during the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis. We'll see that in a minute. You also make an enormous amount of ATP during the light-dependent. Because if electrons are being stripped away from water and being shuttled to somewhere else, that should make you think of the electron transport system that happened during cellular respiration, where we generated a lot of ATP through chemiosmosis. And you have the same phenomenon here. But if those electrons originally came from water, what happens when you split water? What do you get? Oxygen gas. So oxygen gas is another product of the light-dependent reactions. Yeah.
Sorry, what's even the point of the light-independent reactions if they already have enough ATP to do so?
Well, because they've got to store energy, and so they store. You can't really transport ATP easily into and out of cells, but you can do it with sugars. And then sugars is a much better way of storing up energy. And so if you're generating a lot of ATP, that's good, but you also need a way of storing energy. And so the sugars provide a mechanism by which they can store energy and transport it more efficiently to other tissues. Yeah. Most of the sugar a plant makes, it eats itself. Only about 5 to 10% of the sugar a plant makes is available to the people eating the plants or the animals eating the plants. So, in case you were wondering. All right. So here are our set of questions that are going to relate to the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis. What are the two processes of the light-dependent reactions? How does light provide energy? How does the plant harvest light energy? And then finally, how do electrons flow through the photosystems? Because this gives us some information on how we actually generate ATP. How we actually generate ATP. All right, so our first question. What are the two processes of the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis? So in order for the light energy to be harvested in a way other than, because our tissues harvest light energy as well, right? What do our tissues harvest light energy to do?
Vitamin D production?
Yep, to make vitamin D, but the overwhelming majority of the light energy we harness goes into burning our tissues, right? Not really doing a lot good, but do making vitamin D production. It's a little bit different, and we don't store that energy up. So if you're going to harness sunlight in a form of chemical potential energy, which is different than converting calcium into vitamin D, if you're going to harness it to store it up, you've got to do two things. One, you've got to absorb the light. You've got to absorb the light. And so this we can do. We can absorb light. But the thing that plants can do, or photosynthetic organisms can do, not just plants, that we can't do, is to actually absorb light and then bounce it around until it gets to the exact right wavelength to strip electrons away from water. Okay. That's something photosynthetic organisms can do that we cannot. Yeah.
Which wavelength is that?
Depends on the photosystem. Sometimes it's 680 nanometers, sometimes it's 660. 680 and 660, 680 and 640, 680 and 620, 680 and 700, 680 and 700. Okay, there you go. The 20s bouncing around. All right, so the pigments are located within photosystems, and these are within the thylakoid membranes. And again, these can bounce around, absorb light until it gets to the right wavelengths to strip the electrons away from water. Can our cells absorb light at those wavelengths? Absolutely. But we don't have the mechanism by which we can then harness that to strip electrons away from water. Okay. All right, so that's one part that has to happen in the light-dependent reactions to harness sunlight. The other part is you need to be able to synthesize NADPH and ATP. So you need to be able to absorb the light, and then you need to be able to store that energy as chemical potential energy. And the way photosynthetic organisms do that, they store it as electrons on NADPH and as energy in ATP. So electrons from water are passed to NADP+, but that's down a long chain. The hydrogen from water is shuttled against its concentration gradient, just like hydrogen is shuttled against its concentration gradient in the mitochondria. And then what do hydrogen do when you set up a really steep concentration gradient and a really steep electrical gradient? They try to move down that gradient. But can hydrogen move through a lipid bilayer? No, they cannot. So the hydrogen cannot move readily through the thylakoid membranes, but can through a channel that's part of a pump called ATP synthase. And that channel allows hydrogen ions to move through, and as those hydrogen ions move through, the kinetic energy is used to slap an inorganic phosphate onto a ADP molecule to generate ATP. Harnessing kinetic energy. It's fantastic. It's as though you could take two cars, ram them together, and then harness that energy to actually build and store it. Should be really awesome if batteries work that way. Make it a lot more entertaining, right? To flip a switch and fire up power on. Did you see the battery that Tesla built for a city in Australia? So they built like a battery to power a backup like generator to keep power to the city, and this battery is enormous. I mean, this battery is equivalent to hundreds of millions of batteries of what you would use to like run a house. It's an incredible battery. And so what it does is it allows you to, in a fraction of a second, restore power to an entire city. It's pretty fantastic. It's an awesome battery.
It's interesting though this way life uses energy and all
Yep.
the mechanisms. Our ways of doing it are very clumsy.
Even those that are copied off of the way living organisms do it. Yep, they're very clumsy.
I can't help
clunky.
but wonder if there's so much potential, engineering potential to generate new machines that are.
Yeah, it's called. Are you talking about like biomimicry? This idea of copying?
Not necessarily biomimicry, although you could include that. But like, why can't we harness the energy of a water molecule being split and use that for?
We
things
can.
like that?
We can, just not as efficiently as God can.
Right.
So,
It's
but yeah, we
interesting.
can. Yeah, I actually have a former student of mine that works for the Air Force, and he studies flocks of birds and how they communicate with each other, and they use that technology to improve the planes, unmanned aircraft, and how they communicate with each other to avoid collisions. Pretty awesome. That's what he does. He just goes around and studies birds and how they respond to movement within an entire flock, and they're using that technology for unmanned aircraft. Mostly the small ones, like a drone with a 12-foot wingspan. So, which then Lockheed is shooting down with lasers, those drones with the 12-foot wingspan. It's cool stuff. All right, so how does light provide energy? So light is a type of energy called radiant energy. It travels in waves, but it behaves like a particle. And in studying light and in studying electrons, we've predicted that actually everything travels as a wave but behaves like a particle. And so even we, as we move, travel like a wave, but we're so massive that you don't notice the wave action. So the electromagnetic spectrum encompasses all of light at any possible frequency, any possible wavelength, And the plants are using this and are trapping this energy. Because it travels as a wave, but behaves like a particle, light displaces materials as it collides with an object. So as light collides with an object, it actually displaces the medium, or displaces material. And that material being displaced may very well be an electron trapped in an orbital shared by oxygen and hydrogen. And so if that's the case and you displace that electron, that's how you rip or split an electron away from a water molecule. Because the electron absorbs the light and actually breaks free from that orbital shared by oxygen and hydrogen. All right, so each wavelength, or each wave has a wavelength, and in the entire electromagnetic spectrum, it varies anywhere from 10 to the minus 6 nanometers up to 10 to the third kilometers. So a nanometer is 1/billionth of a meter, and so 10 to the minus 6 would be, what's after a trillion? You just use a million trillion. 1 million trillionth of a meter, all the way up to 10 to the third kilometers, which a kilometer is 1,000 meters. And then what is this in parentheses over on the right? This is a visible portion of the spectrum. And so we usually deal with this when we talk about photosynthesis and we talk about plants. We usually relate it to the visible spectrum. But you have to keep in mind plants are absorbing light across the spectrum. Plants are absorbing light across the spectrum. So energy in a unit of light, we call this a photon, is inversely proportional to its wavelength. And what does that mean? If it's inversely proportional to its wavelength? Greater the wavelength, the less the energy. Lower the wavelength, smaller the wavelength, the higher the energy. Okay, it's a fairly important concept to keep in mind. So here's the entire electromagnetic spectrum. We deal with the visible light. That's what we can see. It's the easiest to deal with. And then so you can see what a plant is absorbing based on what color you see. And if you see that a plant is green, what does that mean? If a plant is green, what does that mean?
It's absorbing not green.
Right, it's absorbing every part of the visible spectrum other than green. It's reflecting green back, and that's why you see green. But if we were able to see outside of the visible spectrum, you would see other parts where plants are reflecting that back and other parts where they are not, and absorbing parts outside of the visible spectrum. All right. We need to do another lecture break at this point. Okay? And so we've talked a little bit about light energy. We've talked a little bit about what have to be products and what you have to do to harness light energy. And what I'd like for you to do right now is working with people in your groups. I would like for you to basically come up with a model, if you will, of the electron transport chain. So you know that ultimately electrons are moving from water to NADP+, right? But as part of this chain, something needs to happen. You have to pump hydrogen ions against their concentration gradient, right? So that you can allow those hydrogen ions to move down their concentration gradient and fuel ATP. So you already have a bit of information already, but what I'd like for you to do is, working with those around you, come up with a model of how the electrons move in between water and NADP+, okay? And what's going on in the middle. All right? Make sense? Okay. All right. Go ahead and take a couple of minutes, starting now.
Membrane, right? And then on one side, so it splits the. Gosh,
splitting, well, we have light knocking electrons off of water, right?
Well, first what it does is it makes the little hydrogen excited. So there's the hydrogen ion just sitting there, and then the light like zaps it, and it's like, I think it's outside, and it jumps to a higher concentration. And then it's like, and then there's the other one, it's just singing the other one. And then finally it gets like another one. And then it like, instead of just like being excited, it just gives an entire electron to it. So then you have something with an extra electron, and then 8 hydrogen is left of that one. So it's a hydrogen plus ion and a negative ion. And they get separated between the membranes by being actively transported. I can't remember which is inside. I think the inside is negative. So all the negative ones get transported into the hydrogen membrane, and all the protons are still outside. So they're trying to like do stuff, but they can't because the membrane's separating them. And then there's like a little hole, the little ATP synthase thing kind of is like the transport, and so it's like swarming through, the little protons are swarming through that chain, and as they're swarming through, the energy of it going through attaches the extra electron to the NADP.
All right. So wrap up your thoughts.
Pluses are the energy of the pluses going through are adding electrons to the NADP.
So they're synthesizing
It's
it.
making the ATP, not the NAD. But they're doing both.
The electrons are being stripped off the water and put on the
Right.
So you need a mechanism that makes sure that once that electron gets knocked off, it gets
All right. So I want you to think about this. So why does oxygen act as the final electron acceptor in cellular respiration? And when it does, when oxygen acts as the final electron acceptor, the oxygen combines with hydrogen to form water, right? And the reason why that acts as the final electron acceptor is why?
Because it's the most electronegative thing like in the whole.
It's one of the most stable orbitals electrons can be in,
Yeah, super electronegative.
which means it's one of the lowest energy orbitals that electrons can possibly be in. And that's why oxygen is such a wonderful component to be the final electron acceptor. So the electrons in water, in that bond between the oxygen and the hydrogen, are in an incredibly stable, incredible low energy orbital. And those are the electrons that you use to start this process. That doesn't make any sense, right? Because you want electrons to move down in energy because you need to accomplish 2 things. One, you need to reduce something so that then ultimately you can reduce carbon, right? So in the light dependent, you need to reduce something so that then you can reduce carbon and take those electrons from NADPH and give them to carbon. Okay, that's one thing we need to accomplish. And the only way you can accomplish that is by allowing electrons to move to a lower orbital. But the other thing you need to accomplish is you need to make energy. You need to be able to store energy up. So you need to be able to shuttle hydrogen ions against their concentration gradient. And what's required to pump hydrogen ions against the concentration gradient? Energy. So you need electrons to move to NADP plus, and the only way they're going to move is if they can drop to lower energy levels, and you need to generate energy to actively transport hydrogen ions. The only way you can do that is if electrons drop to a lower energy level and release energy. Well, how are you going to do that if what you're starting with are electrons at a really low energy level in water?
amp it up.
Yes, you ramp up those electrons, and how do you do that?
Light.
Light. That's where the sunlight comes in. So the sunlight comes in and strips those electrons away from water and shoots them up to a really, really high energy level. And so it's the electrons are harnessing the sunlight, and when they do, they go up to a really high orbital that's very unstable. And it's so high, in fact, that it actually leaves the nucleus of the oxygen and hydrogen entirely and ends up being transferred as an electron by the photosystem to an electron receiver, to something that can be reduced. And then that's unstable, so the electrons go to another thing where they can go to an even lower orbital, all the way until the point where they get back down to where they were in the first place, and that's to water. And that's why we still produce some water in this process of photosynthesis. Although some of those electrons are lost entirely. It's sad. Some of them go to sugar, some of them just go to wherever everything goes when it's lost. No, to thermal meltdown. Yeah.
So the photosystem, is that similar, maybe comparable to like an enzyme that like holds the water molecule so that when those electrons are stripped off, that's what ensures that electron gets to the NAD?
Well, they're molecules that can be reduced, right? They need to be able to be reduced. That is, they need to be able to take on electrons.
Yeah.
But just because they can take on electrons doesn't mean they're going to take on electrons that are then happy, right? So, for example, never mind. We can have this conversation. I'm going to get myself in trouble, so I'm going to stop talking. And so, the electrons in this pigment molecule and in the water at a really, really low energy level, really stable. But when they absorb sunlight, they get shot up to a really high energy level that is very unstable. They're at an excited state, and they don't want to stay there because electrons want to be at the lowest energy level possible. That's why bonds form in the first place, so that the electrons can enter into lower energy levels. So there are two things that can happen. As this electron is excited, it can drop back down, and when it does, it'll release light, which then that light can go to like a neighboring pigment, and an electron gets excited, jumps up, and then drops back down, releasing light. And this is what I'm talking about, of just shuffling and passing light around until it gets to the right wavelength. But if it's at the right wavelength, the electron can be entirely stripped away from water and sent up to an electron accepting molecule.
So light, it actually transports light, right? Is that what you said?
It's not transporting light, it's reflecting light. Yeah, so it's absorbing some light and usually reflecting back a slightly different wavelength of light. Because some of that energy is lost. Not all of it is perfectly conserved. So let's say it absorbed light at a wavelength of 500 nanometers, which that light is too high energy to strip the electrons away from water well, right? Because you want to it's too much energy, right? Lower wavelengths, higher energy, and our key wavelengths are 680 and 700. So if it's 500 nanometers, that light has too much energy. But the electrons still may absorb that, and they'll get excited, they'll drop back down, but they're going to lose some of that energy when they do. So they may emit light not at 500 nanometers, but at 520 nanometers, which is slightly less energy because some of that energy was lost. And then their neighboring molecule is going to take that light now at 520. Its electron gets excited. It drops back down and releases something at 550. And all the way until you get to the right energy level, that right wavelength, which is 680 or 700, depending on the photosystem. And then that's the right wavelength to actually strip electrons away from this bond between oxygen and hydrogen.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Why don't they glow? Why don't plants glow if they're releasing?
They do. They glow green.
But like if you turn off the light, you don't see it.
Well, because if you turn off a light, they're not absorbing light, and therefore they're not reflecting it. It's instantaneous. They don't store it up and then reflect it later. So something that glows stores it up and then reflects it later. They're storing up that light energy not as, electrons that are staying at a high energy level. They're storing up that energy as ATP.
So plants are glowing?
Yes, everything is glowing. You're glowing too, and that's the reason why we see you. But once you cut off the light, you're not storing up. So some organisms can store that light energy as electrons that are forced to stay at a high energy level until it's ready to emit light. We don't do that. All right, so if the electron completely gets transferred to a neighboring molecule, or if the electron drops back down to a lower energy level, either way, that energy, usually in the form of light, can be transferred to a neighboring pigment. And again, it just kind of bounces around. It almost looks like a game of hot potato. Do you know about hot potato? It's a game I played when I was a kid. I don't know if people still play it because I'm old. And things are more creative. I don't know, maybe less creative now. But yeah, where it's just like you just keep passing this around until time runs out, and then somebody's left with the potato. You smack them in the face, and then they're out. Right? That's not how you played hot potato? Okay. So here are basically your possibilities. All right. So the electron can be excited and then drop back down. The electron can be excited and move over to an electron accepting molecule. Or the electron can get excited, drop back down, and release its light to a neighboring pigment. And that was my example of say it absorbed light at 500 nanometers, which is too high energy to strip the electron away from water. And so it emits light at a lower energy, maybe 520 nanometers. And I know that's a little weird that the number's getting higher, but it's lower energy. But that's because they're inversely related. All right? We're out of time. Happy Wednesday.
It's not a happy day.
You're welcome.